The morning at Cedar Ridge Sanctuary felt unbearably still. Maggie, a black lab who had lost her entire litter overnight, lay in her pen, heavy with milk and grief. And just across the yard, 3 tiny bobcat kittens cried out, refusing every bottle, desperate for a heartbeat that wasn't there. So Sarah made a choice no one expected. She carried the orphans to Maggie's side, risking rejection, praying that grief could answer grief, and what happened next would change them all. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below, and if this moment moves you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of courage, heartbreak, and hope. The first light over the Montana highlands didn't so much rise as it seeped, thin gold pooling across the frost-stiff grasses, sliding over lodgepole pines, touching the cedar shingles of the sanctuary like a hesitant hand. Behind the rehab barn, where the earth still held last night's cold, a black Labrador lay curled in a figure 8, as if folding in on the ache that would not loosen. Her name was Maggie. Her ribs rose and fell shallowly, a rhythm that sounded like someone trying not to cry. Cedar Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary wakes in layers. The ravens claim the sky first, stitching it with their clacks. Then the practical hums, the generator's throat clearing, the clink of stainless bowls in the clinic sink, boots on gravel. The smell is a tangle of hay, iodine, pine sap, thawing earth. On most mornings, Maggie would have been the first shadow at the gate, tail sweeping the ground like a broom. Today, she didn't lift her head. Her body hadn't gotten the news that her life had changed overnight. Milk let down in her, a quiet, insistent ache. Her flanks still twitched with phantom kicks, but the whelping crate stood empty, sheets clean, pads folded, the little heating disk gone cold. 7 small graves had been tamped into the meadow before the frost hardened. The stones over them were careful and even, as if neatness could make a prayer. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who ran Cedar Ridge, came out of the clinic with a mug steaming and stopped when she saw Maggie. Sarah always moved like the mountain weather, steady, adaptable, never dramatic until the moment she needed to be. She'd cut her own hair blunt at the shoulders with a pair of EMT scissors last spring and never apologized for it. She set the mug on the railing, crouched, and let her hand rest an inch above Maggie's shoulder before touching, asking permission with the space. When the dog didn't flinch, Sarah eased her palm down into the fur. "Morning, girl," she said, and left it at that. It wasn't that Maggie wouldn't eat. It was that the body didn't see the point. Postpartum depression in animals can read like stubbornness if you don't know what you're looking at. The slow blink, the turned face, the refusal of broth and chicken, and even the peanut butter that usually unspooled her self-control. Her eyes had gone flat, not in anger but in vacancy, a porch with the light off. When the sanctuary cats passed at a distance, her gaze didn't track. When a squirrel chattered from the pine, her ears stayed down. Maggie had not always carried silence like a pack. Before Cedar Ridge, before the belly and the grief, she'd worked alongside the county search and rescue volunteers, nose to ground on cold mornings, pulling scent like a ribbon through the brush. She'd found a lost boy once in the coulees above the river, had laid down next to him and kept him warm until the team came. But that was 2 summers ago. Another handler, another life. Whatever went wrong in her previous home went wrong without witnesses. What matters is she arrived at the sanctuary late in the season, belly round, eyes not yet empty, but wary. Someone had driven her out to the county road and unlatched a door. That's all. Love doesn't always begin with trumpet music. Sometimes it begins with a shrug and a wrong turn, and a woman like Sarah stopping her truck because the shadow by the ditch looked back. The morning widened. Sunlight glided up the fence posts, struck the old bell by the porch where volunteers ring when there's good news. No one rang it. Coyotes had been yipping on the far ridge at dawn, a thin, excited sound. Now they were quiet, and the quiet felt louder for it. Somewhere deeper in the trees, an elk bugled, the sound shaped like a question. Sarah tried broth. She tried warm goat's milk, diluted and sweetened with a touch of honey. She tried the kind of soft words you don't mean to say aloud. Come on, sweetheart. Come on. Because there's no one to hear you except the creature who can't answer. She sat with Maggie until the mug went cold and the sun pushed a square of warmth onto the porch. When her phone cracked the quiet, radios don't always reach the gullies here, so cell calls mean someone's above the canyon. She let it ring once in her hand and then answered. Cedar Ridge, she said. A ranger's voice, clipped but threaded with urgency. They'd found sign of a kill near the fire road. Snares, poachers, a doe, maybe two, and another thing, smaller, stranger, a den torn open, tracks the size of biscuit tops leading away, veering, weakening. They had eyes on 3 tiny shapes tucked under a fallen aspen, mewing so softly the wind almost erased them. It's not our jurisdiction to seize the snares, the ranger said, anger held hard in his throat. But the kits, Sarah, they're not going to make it. Sarah's eyes slid to the empty crate through the screen door. Milk and absence. Absence and milk. There are decisions you think about for days, and decisions that arrive fully grown, already wearing boots. She stood. I'm on my way, she said, already moving, already loading the emergency tote in her mind. Warming pads, subcutaneous fluids, 22-gauge butterfly needles, kitten nipples no bigger than a thimble, amoxicillin, towels she'd warmed in the dryer until they held a kindness. Keep them tucked from the wind. No cow's milk, just warmth. She hung up and looked at Maggie for a long beat that contained a dozen roads not taken. The Labrador lifted her head an inch, then let it drop. A surrender that felt too familiar. The world keeps asking the wounded to get up. It isn't fair, and yet the asking doesn't stop. Back soon, Sarah told her. And when she turned toward the clinic, Maggie's ears twitched once, as if some thin thread in her had registered the word soon. On the drive out, the road shouldered past the meadow and entered the darker line of pine. Snow held on in blue shadows where the sun hadn't reached. Sarah watched the light, thinking about the impossible math the day had put on her desk. 3 wild lives on one side, a mother with milk and grief on the other. Sometimes the mountain gives you one door. You don't argue with the carpentry. At the Fire Road pullout, the ranger waved her down to where the aspen had fallen in last winter's storm. The kittens were smaller than she'd braced for, 2 to 3 weeks by the look. Ears still folded, eyes in that milky in-between, bodies trembling from the inside. When she lifted one, its ribs were an abacus under the skin. The air smelled of cold iron and sap, and the bitter tang of human scent where it did not belong. Wire, oil, a cigarette crushed into the duff. She warmed them against her chest, one at a time, slid the needles under paper-thin skin, watched the tent lift and soften as fluids went in. A tiny paw kneaded the air once, then fell still in shocky exhaustion. The mews were so small, they felt like thoughts rather than sounds. Back at Cedar Ridge, Sarah set the incubator to a soft whoosh and tucked 3 small bodies under towels like a promise. She moved through the motions like a ritual. Antibiotics measured, air temp checked, formulary open to the page on orphaned lynx and bobcat, yet felt the day pulling her toward a decision whose shape she could see only in outline. She glanced through the screen again. Maggie had moved. Not far. Just enough that her muzzle now pointed toward the clinic door as if, in her sleep, she had turned to face the place where need was strongest. There are moments, if you work with animals long enough, when the line between science and grace goes translucent, and you can see both. Sarah stood in that thin light now, the new day bright on her shoulders, and knew the ordinary rules would not be enough. Somewhere in the quiet, milk let down again in a body that had no one to feed. Somewhere else, 3 wild mouths searched the air for a mother who would never return. The mountain was offering one door. Sarah reached for the handle. The call from the ranger still echoed in Sarah's ear long after she returned with the emergency tote. Cedar Ridge's clinic was already humming when she carried the fragile bundle inside. 3 bobcat kittens no bigger than her palms, their fur patchy with damp, bodies trembling in shock. She laid them gently beneath the red glow of the incubator, each tiny chest pumping like a bird caught mid-flight. They were 2, maybe 3 weeks old, their ears folded, their eyes cloudy with that unsteady milk blue of new life. Their cries weren't loud. They were soft, gasping mews, the kind of sound that seemed to dissolve in the air almost before you could hear it. Still, every note pierced the room. Even the volunteers, used to rescues that came in battered and bloody, stopped to listen. Sarah worked quickly. She slipped 22-gauge butterfly needles under their skin, warming fluids pushing life back into bodies that had cooled too fast. Towels pulled from the dryer became makeshift nests. She rubbed their tiny ribs with a fingertip, coaxing circulation, murmuring words that weren't really meant for them so much as for herself. Hold on, hold on. The clinic smelled of iodine and pine disinfectant. A volunteer named Chris hovered by the counter, ready with syringes. "Should we try formula?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. They're too cold, too weak. First warmth, then fluids. Food will only shut them down." Still, as the hours wore on and their tremors slowed, the kittens turned their heads instinctively toward her palm, nuzzling, searching for something she could not give. They rooted at the nipple of a kitten bottle, then rejected it, jaws clamping shut, tongues refusing to latch. Sarah tried warming the formula, cooling it, switching nipples, even smearing the faintest trace of honey on the tip. Nothing. The kittens pawed weakly, then sagged against the towels, exhausted. "They won't take it," Chris whispered, worry plain. "Maybe they're too far gone." Sarah heard herself answer, her voice low but steady. "They're not gone. Not while they're still crying." By mid-afternoon, the clinic lights seemed too bright, too clinical against the frailty before them. Sarah rubbed her temples, staring at the incubator. The kittens needed a mother. Not a human hand, not latex gloves, not syringes. A mother with warmth, a heartbeat, and milk laced with the oxytocin that carried comfort as surely as it carried nutrition. Her gaze drifted through the open doorway to the porch. There, Maggie lay in her hollow, head on her paws, eyes still vacant with grief. Her body was heavy with milk she couldn't spend, a mother with no children. Inside, 3 wild infants gasped for the mother they had lost. children with no one to claim them. Sarah's throat tightened. "They won't survive without a mother," she said, almost to herself, almost to the quiet Montana air that carried more truth than she was ready to name. The incubator ticked softly, its fan humming like a heartbeat in the sterile room. But the sound felt wrong, too mechanical, too empty. Sarah pressed her hand to the glass and watched as one of the kittens batted its paw, a slow-motion reach for something it could not find. Outside, Maggie shifted in her sleep, ears twitching, as if some part of her, even in sorrow, was listening. The mountain had presented a cruel symmetry. One mother without young, 3 young without a mother. And Sarah knew the day was only just beginning to ask its hardest questions. The silence inside the clinic felt heavier than the Montana pines pressing down outside. 3 bobcat kittens mewed faintly under the incubator's glow, their tiny ribs fluttering like moth wings. The staff hovered, helpless, syringes and bottles set aside. No matter what they tried, different formulas, warmed nipples, honey to tempt them, the kittens turned away. They wanted something else, something no human hand could give. Sarah stood by the window, eyes fixed on Maggie sprawled on the porch. The black Labrador hadn't moved much in days, her body heavy with milk, her soul heavy with loss. Sarah rubbed her palms together, as if friction alone could spark the answer. And then the thought came, bold and unwelcome, like lightning striking dry ground. "What if—" she whispered, then stopped. Chris, the young volunteer, turned. "What if what?" Sarah faced them all, the small team of techs, volunteers, and interns who'd seen her steady in crises before. But this wasn't broken bones or chemical burns. This was a question of instinct, of trust. "What if we let Maggie try?" she said. The room stilled. Someone dropped a pen. It clattered against the metal tray. "You mean—" Chris began, but couldn't finish. "Yes," Sarah said. "Let Maggie foster them." Arguments burst instantly. "They're bobcats, not puppies," one tech snapped. "She could hurt them without meaning to." Another shook his head. "Cross-species fostering isn't predictable. Disease transmission, rejection, stress. There are risks we can't calculate." Sarah held up a hand, not to silence them, but to steady the current. "I know the risks, but look at them." She pointed at the incubator, where the smallest kitten pawed weakly at the glass, searching. "They don't just need milk. They need a mother. Maggie has milk. She has instincts. She has loss. Sometimes grief knows how to meet grief." The words sounded strange even to her, but she believed them. Science could list the dangers, but she also knew about oxytocin, the hormone that drives maternal care. It can leap species boundaries. She'd read studies, goats nursing antelopes, cats raising squirrels, even a tiger that once nursed piglets in Thailand. Love, when sparked, didn't care about taxonomy. The staff looked at one another, unease rippling. "And if she rejects them? Then we pull them out immediately," Sarah said. "I'll set up the observation room, infrared cameras. We'll monitor every second. They won't be alone with her until we're ready. But if we don't try—" She glanced back at the incubator. "They won't last 3 days." Her voice caught, but she steadied it with a breath. "Sometimes nature hands us a door we didn't build. We can either step through or stand here arguing while 3 lives fade." The debate softened into silence. No one wanted to be responsible for saying no. Finally, Chris spoke. If anyone can make this work, it's you and Maggie. Sarah nodded, feeling both the weight and the chance of what she'd just set in motion. Then let's prepare. Towels, cameras, a quiet room near the porch. Everything clean, no strange scents. If it works, we'll have to document every detail for the science and for the story. She looked once more at Maggie outside, her muzzle resting on her paws, eyes half closed but ears faintly twitching, as if even in sorrow she was waiting for something. "All right," Sarah whispered. "Let's give grief a chance to heal grief." And with that, Cedar Ridge prepared for a moment that could either end in heartbreak or become a miracle no one would forget. The observation room smelled faintly of cedar shavings and fresh laundry, a deliberate attempt to make the place feel less like a clinic and more like a den. A padded mat stretched across the floor, flanked by hidden cameras and a quiet hum from the infrared monitors. Volunteers hovered behind the glass wall, tense, silent. On the mat, Maggie lay curled, her eyes still hollow, though her ears twitched at the new sounds filling the room. Sarah knelt by the crate where the bobcat kittens huddled. Their mews were thin, uneven, fading too fast. She swallowed hard, one hand steady on the latch. "This has to work." She opened the door and lifted the first kitten out. Its body was light, fragile, no more weight than a handful of pine cones. She lowered it gently onto the mat, a foot from Maggie's paws. The Labrador turned her head, sniffed once, then looked away. A soft growl, low and uncertain, rolled from her throat. "Easy, girl," Sarah murmured from the doorway. Her voice was calm, but her pulse thudded in her ears. She nodded at Chris to keep the camera trained, just in case. The kitten gave a weak cry, a thin, broken note that cut through the air like glass. Maggie froze. Her nostrils flared, then flinched, as if the sound had struck a nerve too raw to touch. Slowly, painfully, she turned back. Her eyes met the bundle of fur staggering toward her. Another cry. Maggie trembled. Her chest expanded with a sharp breath. Then, to the astonishment of every eye behind the glass, she lowered her muzzle and licked the kitten once across the head. The room seemed to exhale as one. Sarah brought out the other two, setting them close but not too close. For a moment, Maggie stiffened again, muscles tight with indecision. But when one pawed blindly at her flank, her body responded before her mind could object. She shifted, opened her stance, and let the kitten nuzzle against her belly. The first latch was clumsy, desperate. The second followed, then the third. Maggie's body jolted at the tug, as though startled to feel life pulling from her again. Her eyes, so vacant for days, blinked with something new, confusion, ache, recognition. She lowered her head until her chin brushed their backs, a shield, a claim. Behind the glass, Sarah pressed a fist to her mouth. Her vision blurred, but she didn't dare look away. "Nature's miracle," Chris whispered hoarsely beside her. The kittens suckled, their frail bodies pressed into Maggie's warmth, and the sound of their tiny gulps filled the room like a hymn. The growl was gone. In its place came a deep, steady sigh, the sound of a mother who, at last, had children to hold. Sarah scribbled into her logbook later. At 4:12 p.m., cross-species fostering observed. Labrador accepted bobcat kittens after initial hesitation. Nursing successful. Emotional response profound. But no words on the page could capture the truth of that moment. A broken dog, 3 orphaned wildlings, and the fragile bridge of instinct that bound them together. For the first time since dawn, hope breathed again inside Cedar Ridge. By the next morning, the sanctuary was alive with a quiet kind of awe. Word had spread among the staff that Maggie had accepted the kittens. No one wanted to jinx it, so conversations were whispered, footsteps softened, as if the walls themselves might collapse under a loud sound. Inside the observation room, the unlikely family had begun to find its rhythm. Maggie lay stretched on her side, her black coat gleaming under the dim red glow. Against her belly, the 3 bobcat kittens nursed with greedy, uneven pulls, paws kneading her fur as though they'd never known anything else. She no longer flinched at their cries. Instead, her ears twitched to catch them, her tongue reaching out every so often to clean their faces, as tenderly as if they were her own lost litter. Sarah scribbled notes in her journal, her pen racing faster than her thoughts. Labrador demonstrates maternal grooming, protective postures observed, kittens responsive, attempting to crawl toward her chest when separated. She underlined one line twice. Motherhood knows no species. The staff supplemented with kitten formula, careful not to let Maggie exhaust herself. But she remained their anchor. When a bottle came, she nosed the kittens toward it, licking their necks as if reassuring them it was safe. When they finished, they stumbled back into her warmth, climbing onto her paws or curling into the crook of her legs. Days passed, and the clinic's mood shifted from tension to wonder. The kittens' eyes began to clear, revealing pale blue marbles that blinked curiously at the world. They wobbled on unsteady legs, bumping into each other, then collapsing in a pile of fur at Maggie's side. Once one managed to crawl up her flank and sprawl across her back like a tiny king on a throne. Maggie didn't budge, only sighed, as though carrying them was exactly what she'd been waiting for. By the 3rd week, Sarah noticed something remarkable in Maggie herself. The dull glaze in her eyes had lifted. She greeted Sarah at the door with a thump of her tail, not frantic, but steady, like a heartbeat rediscovered. When volunteers came to check the cameras, Maggie watched them with quiet confidence, her chin high, her gaze clear. The hollowness was gone. Not everything was seamless. One afternoon, when the kittens tried their first wobbly playfight, Maggie tilted her head, puzzled at their sharp little swats and high-pitched growls. She nudged them apart with her nose, then licked them back into calm, her states insisting on order. The staff chuckled quietly behind the glass. "She's going to raise them like Labradors," Chris joked, "whether they like it or not." Still, the bond deepened. When a sudden clap of thunder rolled across the valley, the kittens startled, tumbling against each other in panic. Maggie instantly rose, curling her body around them, her chest pressing them into stillness. Her ears flicked at the sound, but her gaze stayed soft, as if she were telling them, "You're safe. I've got you." Sarah closed her journal that evening and lingered by the glass. For weeks, she had carried both Maggie's grief and the fragile hope of the bobcat kittens like weights in her chest. Now, watching them tangled together in the red glow, dog and wildcats, sorrow and salvation braided into one, she felt the sanctuary breathe easier. No one could explain it entirely. The scientists could point to hormones, to instinct, to the power of oxytocin. But those who stood in that room knew they were witnessing something larger, something the textbooks couldn't pin down. It wasn't just survival. It was a family. One no one had planned, but one that mattered all the same. 2 months slipped by like river water, carrying with them the sound of tiny paws and Maggie's steady heartbeat. The kittens had transformed from fragile bundles into curious explorers, their coats now thick with rosetted markings that shimmered in the morning sun. They scaled hay bales in the rehab barn, pounced on each other with clumsy ferocity, and batted pine cones as though they were prey. Their voices, once faint mews, now rang with sharp, playful chirps that filled Cedar Ridge with a new kind of music. Maggie, too, had changed. Where once her eyes had been dulled by grief, now they gleamed with a brightness Sarah hadn't seen since before the tragedy. She moved with purpose, tail wagging, ears high, her bark echoing with joy when she led the kittens into the yard for supervised play. She nudged them gently toward adventure, then curled into the grass like a sentinel, watching every tumble with a patient mother's pride. Her body, once weak, now carried new strength born from the duty of care. But in the sanctuary, joy often arrives hand in hand with fear. One crisp evening, Sarah noticed the smallest kitten, later nicknamed Willow, lagging behind her siblings. While the others stalked a cricket in the straw, Willow crouched low, shivering though the air was mild. Sarah knelt, her trained eyes spotting the rapid rise and fall of ribs, the wheeze in the tiny chest. Pneumonia. The diagnosis was swift, but the outcome uncertain. Sarah rushed Willow into the clinic, administering antibiotics, oxygen, warm fluids. Yet the kitten's body was so small, so fragile the odds were steep. The incubator hummed, its red glow painting the fear in Sarah's face. Maggie would not leave her side. When the staff tried to coax her from the clinic, she planted her paws firmly on the tile, her body trembling with determination. Sarah finally relented, spreading a blanket near the incubator. Maggie pressed close, her muzzle resting against the glass, her breath fogging the pain as she whined softly. Through the night, the Labrador licked Willow each time Sarah lifted the kitten for treatment. Her tongue moved carefully, as though she believed warmth could seep from her own body into the kitten's. When Willow's breaths came in ragged bursts, Maggie let out low, aching sounds, as if urging her to fight. She curled around the incubator when exhaustion overtook her, her body radiating the steady reassurance of presence. Sarah worked tirelessly. Nebulizer treatments, careful doses of antibiotics, fluids measured drop by drop. But it was Maggie's vigil that seemed to weave invisible threads of strength. By dawn, Willow's breaths, though still shallow, had steadied. The little body stirred, opening bleary eyes that sought Maggie's silhouette against the glass. 2 days later, Willow nursed again, weak but alive. Maggie wagged her tail for the first time in hours, her joy spilling across the clinic like sunlight. Sarah knelt beside her, burying her face in the dog's neck. "You saved her," she whispered, voice thick with gratitude. "We both did, but you most of all." The sanctuary staff celebrated quietly, humbled by the resilience stitched between species. 3 bobcat kittens had grown stronger under Maggie's care, but in that week of fear, everyone understood something deeper. Maggie had not only given them life, they had given her reason. The crisis passed, but its memory lingered, etched into Cedar Ridge like claw marks on pine bark. From then on, no one doubted the bond that bound Maggie to her wild children. By the time summer rolled across the Montana Valley, the kittens were no longer fragile bundles tucked against Maggie's belly. At 4 to 5 months old, their legs had lengthened, muscles taut with energy, their paws striking the earth with a confidence that startled even the volunteers. The sanctuary's yard became their kingdom. They bounded up low branches with a grace Maggie could never match, their tails flicking in fierce concentration as they learned to balance in the shifting shadows of cedar boughs. Sarah watched from the fence one morning as one of the brothers crouched low in the grass, ears pinned, haunches quivering, his gaze fixed on a sparrow pecking at seeds. A beat later he launched forward, landing short but close enough to send the bird wheeling skyward in a flurry of wings. The kitten let out a rasping growl, more wildcat than baby now, and lashed his tail with something like pride. Maggie tilted her head at the scene, puzzled. She patted closer, sniffing the ground where the bird had been, then nudged the kitten as if reminding him play was safer than hunt. The bobcat only wriggled free, eyes gleaming with instincts Maggie couldn't teach, instincts that came from a lineage she didn't share. At first, Maggie tried to join their games. She bounded clumsily after them, tail wagging, barking in excitement. The kittens froze, startled by the sound, their ears flattening. One hissed, a sharp, instinctive sound that cut Maggie to stillness. She lowered her head, confused, then slunk back to the shade, watching as they returned to their silent stalks and pounces. That evening, Sarah wrote in her journal, "Maggie doesn't understand their wild play. She wants to guide them like puppies, but they're slipping into the world of their own kind." The words weighed on her chest. She knew this day would come, but seeing the distance bloom between them was harder than she imagined. The kittens grew bolder by the week. They wrestled in mock battles, claws unsheathed, their cries echoing through the yard in tones closer to snarls than mews. They leapt onto fence posts, scanned the horizon as if drawn by some unseen compass. Their eyes, once baby blue, had deepened to gold, the same gold that blazed in the eyes of wild bobcats Sarah had glimpsed in the timber. Maggie still guarded them fiercely. When a hawk circled overhead, she barked until it veered away. When thunder split the valley, she curled around them, her warmth a steady reassurance. But during the quiet stretches, she seemed lost, her gaze following them up trees she could never climb, her ears straining to decode the growls she couldn't answer. Sarah felt the ache of it too. She knelt by Maggie one afternoon, her hand resting on the dog's shoulder as the kittens leapt across logs beyond them. "You've done more than anyone could ask," she whispered. Maggie leaned into her touch, but her eyes never left the kittens. By then, the staff knew they had to prepare. Maggie had given them love, milk, protection, but she could not teach them how to survive the wild. Plans began to take shape for a transfer to the rewilding program in the Rockies, where they would learn from their own kind to stalk, hunt, and claim the freedom their blood demanded. For now, though, the cedar air still carried the sound of Maggie's low whine, the tether of love stretching taut between her and the kittens, even as their instincts pulled them further into the wilderness, waiting beyond the fence. The decision came on a golden morning when the valley smelled of sun-warmed pine and distant rain. Sarah loaded the bobcat kittens into padded carriers, her hands steady though her chest ached. Maggie trotted alongside, tail low, eyes fixed on the crates. She didn't know the details, but she knew enough. Her children were leaving. The semi-wild enclosure lay higher in the Rockies, a rugged slope fenced with mesh tall enough to keep them safe, yet open to the winds and scents of their true home. Inside, logs and boulders formed natural perches. Grasses waved tall, hiding mice and insects that darted at dusk. It was a training ground designed not for comfort, but for freedom. When Sarah released the kittens, they hesitated only a moment before bounding into the grass, their bodies sleek, their eyes bright. At first, they circled back, pressing against Maggie's legs, mewing as they always had. She licked their ears, her body trembling with the effort of both pride and fear. But then instinct tugged harder. Within days, they were testing their paws on prey, leaping clumsily at field mice, batting at sparrows, their wildness sharpening. To ease the transition, Sarah introduced an older bobcat, a female with scars across her muzzle, seasoned in raising orphans. The meeting was tense at first, the kittens flattening themselves to the ground. But slowly, they began to follow her, mimicking her crouches, her stillness before a strike. Maggie watched from the edge of the enclosure, head tilted, confused but patient. She could not teach them this, but she would not abandon them either. One afternoon, as the sun dropped low and shadows stretched long, danger slithered into the enclosure. A rattlesnake, scales glinting bronze, slid from beneath a log, its rattle buzzing sharp as broken glass. The kittens, curious, crept forward, ears perked at the alien sound. From the other side of the field, Maggie saw it first. Instinct surged before thought. She lunged, barreling across the grass with a guttural bark that split the air. The kittens froze, startled. The snake coiled. Tongue flicking, body tense to strike. Maggie charged, teeth bared, hackles high. She didn't stop until her paws slammed against the earth between the snake and the kittens. Her growl was deep, primal, a sound Sarah had never heard from her before. The rattlesnake struck once, fangs snapping against empty air as Maggie dodged. She snapped back, jaws clashing just shy of the serpent's tail, forcing it into retreat. The kittens bolted for cover, mewing sharply, while Maggie stood her ground, chest heaving. Only when the rattlesnake slipped back into the rocks did she turn, circling her children, licking their faces as if to count them one by one. From the observation blind, Sarah pressed a hand over her mouth. Tears blurred her vision, but her heart swelled. Here was the truth she had believed from the beginning. Maggie loved them as fiercely as any mother, bound not by blood, but by choice. That evening, Sarah wrote in her journal, "Today, Maggie proved what we already knew. Love doesn't pause at species. It protects. It fights. It endures." And as twilight draped the Rockies in violet light, Maggie lay curled around the kittens one more time, her black coat blending into the shadows, her heartbeat steady as the mountain itself. The weeks that followed felt like watching a slow tide pull away from shore. The bobcat kittens grew leaner, stronger, their muscles tuned to the rhythm of the mountains. They climbed the tallest logs in the enclosure, with ease now, leaping from one branch to another, their golden eyes lit with the fierce confidence of the wild. Each day they spent less time pressed against Maggie's side, and more time testing themselves against the wind, the grass, the prey that darted just out of reach. At first, they always returned. A chase would end with them tumbling back into her warmth, their small bodies curling into her belly as if nothing had changed. But slowly, those moments shortened. One would linger out in the grass. Another would curl beside the older bobcat mentor instead of Maggie. She still licked them when they came, still growled softly at any shadow that startled them. But her role was shifting, whether she wanted it to or not. Sarah saw it too. She spent long evenings by the fence, notebook forgotten in her lap, watching Maggie sit silently as her kittens practiced hunting. "They belong to the mountains," she murmured one night, kneeling to rest her hand on Maggie's back. "Not to us, not even to you." Maggie leaned into her touch, but her gaze stayed fixed on the tree line where the kittens vanished and reappeared like ghosts. The separation wasn't a single moment, but a series of tiny ones. A meal eaten without seeking Maggie first. A nap taken beneath the boughs instead of her flank. A chase that ended too far for her to follow. Each moment tugged at her, yet she bore it with a quiet dignity, her eyes reflecting both longing and a strange acceptance. Then came the evening that sealed it. The sun was sinking, staining the sky in shades of fire. The kittens had slipped into the far end of the enclosure, their forms darting through the underbrush. Maggie barked once, a short, urgent call. Normally they would return, bounding back into her orbit. This time the grass only rustled, then stilled. The wild had called louder than she could. Maggie stood there for a long while, ears pricked, tail stiff, waiting. When no shapes emerged, she sank to her haunches, her chest rising and falling with something heavier than breath. Sarah came to her side, lowering herself to the ground, hand settling gently on Maggie's back. "They're growing into who they're meant to be," Sarah whispered, "and you've given them the start they needed." Maggie didn't move. Her eyes stayed on the darkening line of trees, reflecting the last streaks of sunlight. In their golden depths lay both loss and peace, a mother watching her children step beyond her reach, knowing this was how it had to be. For the first time since the kittens were placed in her care, Maggie didn't follow when night fell. She curled on the ground, silent, her body still but her heart steady. She had carried them as far as she could. The rest belonged to the wilderness. Autumn swept down from the peaks in waves of gold and scarlet, laying its quiet hand across Cedar Ridge. The bobcat kittens were gone now, released into the wild canyons where snowmelt streams cut deep and elk trails wove like veins through the timber. No one at the sanctuary could say exactly where they roamed, but sometimes, on crisp mornings, Sarah thought she heard an echoing yowl carried across the wind, a reminder that wild hearts had claimed their birthright. Back at the sanctuary, Maggie had found a new rhythm. The observation room, once filled with the cries of hungry kittens, now held quiet patience. Sarah trained her gently, easing her into a role as a therapy dog for recovering animals. Injured fawns pressed trembling bodies against her warmth. Orphaned raccoons, bandaged and frightened, curled into her side as if they could still smell the milk of a mother. Even birds, housed in cages near her resting mat, seemed to calm at her steady presence. Maggie had become a guardian, a healer, a bridge. Visitors to Cedar Ridge often asked about the story. Sarah never rushed it. She would walk them past the meadow where Maggie once lay hollow with grief, then into the clinic where the incubator still hummed. Only then would she tell them of a black Labrador who had lost her litter, and the 3 wild kittens who had lost their mother, and how love stitched them together for a time. Some listeners cried openly. Others stood silent, unable to find words. All of them carried something away. Scientists took notice too. Wildlife journals published the case study, marveling at cross-species fostering. They listed oxytocin, maternal instinct, environmental stressors. But Sarah knew the truth was bigger than hormones or data. The truth was written in Maggie's eyes when she had curled around those wild children, in the way she had driven off a rattlesnake with nothing but courage, in the way she had let them go when the time came. The lesson was simple, yet vast. True love isn't possession. It isn't holding tight forever. It's knowing when to open your arms and let the ones you've protected step into their own story. On a late October evening, as the sun slipped behind the ridgeline and painted the sky in lavender fire, Sarah sat on the porch with Maggie at her side. The dog's muzzle had silvered slightly, but her eyes were calm, steady, reflecting the glow of the horizon. Sarah reached down, threading her fingers through the thick black fur. "You did it, girl," she whispered. "You taught us all." Maggie sighed and laid her head on Sarah's knee, content, as if she understood that her journey, through loss, through love, through letting go, had become more than her own. It had become a story of hope, one that would ripple through Cedar Ridge and beyond, reminding anyone who heard it that healing sometimes comes in the most unexpected forms. Under the Montana sky, where the wild and the human meet in fragile harmony, Maggie rested in peace with her place in the world. She had loved, she had let go, and in doing so she had left behind a legacy strong enough to outlast her pause on the earth. Sometimes the most powerful stories don't come from science or statistics, but from the quiet choices of a broken heart that decides to keep giving. Maggie's journey teaches us that love isn't about possession. It's about presence, about protection, and about letting go when the time is right. In the end, her greatest gift wasn't just saving 3 wild lives. It was showing us that healing can cross every boundary we imagine, even the line between species. And maybe that's a question for all of us. Have you ever loved something enough to let it go? Have you seen how animals, in their silence, often understand more about love than we do? If Maggie's story touched you the way it touched us here at Cedar Ridge, hit that like button to let us know. And don't forget to subscribe, because we share stories of courage, heartbreak, and healing every week, and your support helps keep these stories alive. Wherever you're watching from, drop a comment below. Maybe share your own story of an animal who changed your life. We'd love to hear it. Because at the end of the day, Maggie reminds us of one simple truth. Love heals, but nature decides. And isn't that something worth remembering?